Okay, so of course the first one is number 1. Then the Webern starts with number 7. Stravinsky starts with 12. Bartók starts with 24. Copland starts with 31. Penderecki starts with 40. Ives starts with 47. Berg, 48. And Husa, 51. Now, make some more notes here, too. In the middle of the Bartók, close to the end, track number 30 is flawed. So it's not going to sound right. Just ignore it. Okay? Also in the Copland, track number 38 is flawed also. I don't know if it scratches or what, but it's pretty much a total loss on those 2 tracks. So don't worry, we're not going to take anything off those 2 tracks. I just want you to know which ones they are. Okay? 30 and 38. Okay. See, the people who don't come aren't here today either, so they're on their own. We've been talking about 20th century composers. In the 20th century, one of the most important countries was France. And for 2 reasons. One, its involvement in very avant-garde, cutting-edge style music. And the second reason, for its importance in a movement referred to as neoclassicism. Neo, N-E-O, neoclassicism. All right, so what is that? Well, neoclassical composers utilized elements from previous centuries, not necessarily just the classical period, but from older historical periods. So what would that be? Well, it would be like having tonal centers, using recognizable forms from previous periods, melodic constructions, and things like that. However, the neo part is that it's couched in the 20th century idiom of dissonance. So they don't necessarily sound pretty. They are dissonant 20th century compositions, but inside them they use the types of things that we've studied in, say, the Baroque or classical or Romantic period. So it's a mixture of old and new. The first French composer of note is going to be Honegger. He lived until 1955, so he's the first half of the century. He composed music which is big and strong and dramatic, uses a very large orchestra. Among the things that of note here, the dissonance is relatively mild. It's not very severe. The phrasing is clear. It has ostinato rhythms. His most important works are probably 5 symphonies. They use a great big orchestra with very vivid colors, and also 2 oratorios. One of them is King David, and it's the King David from the Bible. And the other one is called Joan of Arc at the Stake. Now, Joan of Arc, among other things, actually uses Gregorian chant medieval folk songs, modern folk songs for that matter, and dance tunes all mixed in together. Another French composer, one that you might have seen the name at least. Milhaud. Milhaud lived till 1974. Milhaud also composed an incredible amount of music in just about every compositional genre you could possibly think of. Obviously somebody who could compose quickly and easily. And he lived a pretty good long life, so he had plenty of time to do it. Milhaud is a very eclectic composer, absorbing influences from lots of different sources. To name a few, Brazilian folk elements, ragtime, blues, the serious art elements of polytonality, chords built of both major and minor thirds at the same time, modal scales. Modals make a comeback, as you know. Well, he composed so much music, it's hard to say what he's especially important for, but I guess if we had to, we would say operas, ballets, string quartets. Another important French composer is Poulenc. Poulenc lived till 1963, has a very individualistic style, all his own. Melodies have very wide skips in them, but the harmony is very tonal. The sound of the music has a kind of a wittiness to it, a sort of satirical sarcasm in its sound. That's kind of the way Parisian salon music was during his lifetime. So a very wide gamut in the music of Poulenc. It looks like he should be pronouncing it Poulon, but I've heard people say that he himself pronounced as Poulenc. Don't know why. So his music could run from the Gloria, which is a very cheerful sounding work for chorus and orchestra and soprano solo. And the solo is a very, very emotional and touching solo, by the way. We've done it with symphony and chorale before, with a guest soloist. All the way to extraordinarily dramatic music. There is an opera called Dialogue of the Carmelites. Dialogue of the Carmelites. Carmelites is C-A-R-M-E-L-I-T-E-S. And a comedy opera called The Breasts of Tiresias. Another type of style for him is a piece called the Pastoral Concerto. It's for chamber orchestra and harpsichord. And it sort of is an allusion back to the music of Rameau and Scarlatti. So a huge variety of style for Poulenc. That opera Dialogue of the Carmelites is, I think, a one-act opera. The Carmelites are nuns, and the most dramatic part is towards the end when they are led down the street to the guillotine. Guillotining nuns, you know. Okay. So it's pretty powerful, pretty dramatic and powerful. Um, Now, one of the giants of the 20th century, Igor Stravinsky. More than one spelling. This is the one I use, but if you find another one, that's okay. Stravinsky lived a very long life, 1882 to 1971. One of the most influential composers of the entire century, a true giant. I remember I was riding in my car, and it was right about this time of year. And I was traveling across the country to do my entrance audition at Indiana. And I heard on the news Igor Stravinsky had died. And I remember thinking at the time, he was the greatest one alive. Who will it be who takes his place as number one? And I don't think anybody can really agree on it since then. When he died, he was number one in the whole world. Since then, I guess there's probably a short list that people could argue about, but nobody really of the same stature as Stravinsky. One of the absolute highest of the high. Now, he is a Russian composer, born in Russia. But he moved to Paris in 1911, and then he moved to the United States in 1940 and lived here until his death in 1971. His early works were his early most successful works, that is to say, were for the Russian ballet, and the director of the Russian ballet was a very famous person named Diaghilev. And Diaghilev was sort of in the habit of identifying promising up-and-coming composers and commissioning them to write the music for his ballets. The Russian ballet was, for a very long time, the premier ballet company in the whole world. So, so this was quite something for Stravinsky. So what are those? Well, one of them is The Firebird, a piece you may have heard, 1910. Another ballet called Petrushka, 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 1911. And then the most famous one of all, Le Sacre du Printemps. The Rite of Spring. Rite, R-I-T-E. The Rite of Spring has a subtitle, we'll give it in English, Pictures of Pagan Russia. By the way, the date of this one is 1913. It just had its centennial. Well, I guess it's this year. I don't know exactly when this year, but this is the 100th anniversary of Le Sacre du Printemps. I haven't heard of it being done too much, but it should be done all over the world this year. So maybe by next fall it will be, because it is a landmark piece of the century. Well, the Firebird has a very large, very colorful and splashy orchestra, and some of the exotic Orientalism in the style of Rimsky-Korsakov, who, by the way, was his teacher. Petrushka is kind of in the same vein, also includes some typical Stravinsky elements, one of which we can identify for that one would be fairly static harmony, against which there are repetitive melodic and rhythmic patterns dancing around. And the, not quotation, but modified quotation of folk tunes and popular tunes. He likes to do that. And the juxtaposition of two different keys together. And he uses in this one an 8-note scale. His 8-note scale is an alternation of major and minor seconds. So not the way our major or minor scale is, but an alternation of those two. So you could build a scale, for example, as the following. Go ahead and write it down. C, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, A sharp, and what would the next note be? C. B sharp, that's right, which is, of course, C, the first note. So follow it all the way up. It is an alternation of half steps and whole steps. So that means that it gets an extra note in the scale from the ones we're accustomed to. He also likes to alternate meters and have unexpected pauses. So from the listening standpoint, it's very difficult to figure out the meter because he keeps changing it and having interruptive silences fairly often. Now, this particular piece is representative of a 20th century style. And by the way, once the Baroque period got going, there was a certain style of music which we can recognize. Doesn't matter if it's Corelli or Bach or Pachelbel or Buxtehude or whoever, we recognize it as a Baroque piece. There is a certain classical style. Doesn't matter if it's Haydn, Mozart, or Beethoven, or Clementi, or Dussek, or Adalbert Giro-Betz, or whoever. It sounds classical. Romantic. We can tell that it's a romantic piece, whether it's Tchaikovsky, or Brahms, or Schubert, or Chopin, or Bruckner, or anybody like that. We can tell it's a romantic piece. Not in the 20th century. There is no way of doing things, way of composing, way of performing. It's just a huge melange of types of composition styles. So one out of a huge bushel basket of them would be the style of this one, which we identify as primitivism. And I wouldn't even say that this is the main style of the 20th century. It's just one of them. In any case, the piece, much like Berlioz and Symphonie Fantastique, was a very disruptive element in music, in its orchestral effects, in its rhythmic patterning, in its new types of sounds. And even in Paris, probably the most avant-garde musical city in the world at the time, where in fact it was premiered. The sound of the music in conjunction with the subject matter apparently scandalized the audience at the time, and the public in general, leading to an uncontrollable uproar during the performance. All right, so what is that subject matter? Well, we said primitivism. So it's a reference to what we imagine the sound of music and activities in primitive, like prehistoric almost, times would be like, the kinds of things that anthropologists would deal with, not so much musicians. Well, people in primitive times were mostly worried about their survival. So, what are their basic needs in order to survive? Food, water, shelter, warmth, perpetuation of the tribe. That's basically the list. Okay? So they have figured out a bunch of things. They know about night and day. They know that the seasons change and that it's regular and predictable. They know how to grow stuff. Some stuff anyway, not a lot of stuff, but some stuff. And they know what they need for that. They need sunshine. They need rain. They need the warmth of the soil. They need for the soil to be fertile so that, they don't have fertilizer, so that, the soil has to be good soil. And they also know how to make children. I guess God gave people the sixth sense of how that's done. But the learning curve is pretty short. So they have some knowledge. Now remember that they don't understand anything that resembles science. They just observe phenomena that happen, but they don't know how it happens. This is how people dreamed up gods. Gods who got the credit or the blame for things happening. So if the wind blew too hard, it must be the god of the wind who is displeased. If we had drought, it must be the god of rain who is displeased. And so on and so on and so on. They attribute things to things unseen because they've got no explanations for them. All right, so they know about spring because this is the time now where it's going to get warmer. We're going to have warmth from the sun. Soil temperature is going to come up. We're likely to have rain instead of snow and ice. And they see the signs that it's coming. All right, so the tribe gets together for a big ceremony, and they're appealing to the gods to please look kindly upon them this year so that they'll be able to create a storehouse of food that will last them through the next bleak winter. So they all come out, form a big circle. The young, virile men of the tribe get in the center of the circle. They lie face down, and they demonstrate to the gods what they mean by fertility. Getting this picture? Well, there is a place in the Rite of Spring early on, and it's on your selection. Which is kind of like this. This is a ballet. Well, if Diaghilev was very faithful to the story, then there's probably a lot of really suggestive stuff in here that scandalized the audience. And there was a group of rich ladies who lived in a certain area of town. They were rich, they dressed up, they kind of came out with stuff like this. And they were deprecatingly referred to as the bitches. And they, among others, apparently went kind of crazy in the audience during the premiere of this. And Diaghilev, the dancing master, is in the wings of the stage, yelling out the numbers so that the dancers can stay together over not only the sound of the large orchestra, but all the commotion that's out in the audience. They're probably kind of going berserk a little bit. Now, if you've ever been up close to a dance company, I guess you'd kind of have to be on stage with him or in the orchestra pit or something like that. One of the things that you find is that as they are dancing their moves and sets and stuff up there, they're counting to each other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how they stay together when they're not looking at each other. You know, the people who are grouped together, they can hear each other count, stuff like that. Well, you'll find in our excerpts from the Rite of Spring that the meter is not 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and or anything like that. It's all crazy. It's all mixed meter. And so the dancers were ballistic about the whole thing. The orchestra had to practice it with Stravinsky for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and they maintained that it was unplayable, and they hated it. And some of them stalked out from time to time and had to be enticed back. So the strange thing about the story, and the story's been romanticized, that Stravinsky escaped out a back door into an alley and was whisked away by a waiting coach with his wife and not much else. And that's a romanticization, I'm sure, because if they've rehearsed this piece for 8 or 10 weeks, you know word's going to get out about how it is. And there's probably going to be some little bit in the paper about it as people are buzzing about it. So people wouldn't have been totally unprepared for it. I don't think his life was in danger, but the hissing and booing and shouting and stuff like that, that's no doubt true. So, 100th anniversary, I hope you get to hear it live sometime. If not, at least on recording. All right, so be prepared for accents destroying the feeling of the meter, and as a listener being a little disoriented and having it sound a little bit random, even though in fact it's notated in 4/4. So, World War I, so-called war to end all wars, which we've spoken of before, forced a great many composers, including Stravinsky, to give up composing for these huge orchestras and forced them to go to smaller forces. This is one of the characteristics of neoclassicism, is that they are typically not for huge orchestras. They're for more reduced forces. Not every neoclassical piece is for a smaller group, but many of them are. It is a general characteristic of it. A few examples from Stravinsky of stuff that we can call maybe neoclassical. L'Histoire du Soldat. Les Noces. Suppose you could even call the octet a neoclassical piece. L'Histoire du Soldat, The Soldier's Tale, is for 6 players, plus percussion, and narrator. Pretty small forces, just soloists, basically. Les Noces is for 4 pianos and percussion. The octet, obviously for 8 players. Now, all of his works are not this small, but they're good examples of small ones after the large opulent orchestras of those ballets that we mentioned, which are very large orchestras. As were most other composers of the century, Stravinsky was heavily influenced by American jazz. Jazz is one of our greatest contributions to music from this country. Now, neoclassicism is a fairly short-lived movement. It only takes up part of the century. It basically goes from 1922, which is the year of the octet, to 1951, which is the year of an opera called The Rake's Progress. The Rake's Progress is a really doable opera. I don't know why hardly anybody does it. All right, so neoclassicism, an emphasis on balance, clarity, objectivity, economy. It's predominantly a contrapuntal texture. It includes both diatonic and chromatic harmony, and sometimes involves the obvious imitation of specific melodies or style traits of older composers. By the way, it's totally absolute music, not program music, it's absolute music. Now, one of the reasons, I think, for them coming up with neoclassicism, Stravinsky and a few others, is that music between about 1910 and 1920 sounded like chaos. And they were trying to bring some sound and feeling of order back to serious music after a decade of seeming chaos. Stravinsky had studied music of the past, like Bach, like the classical composers. And during this neoclassical period, his works were fairly diatonic. The tonal centers are pretty easily perceivable most of the time. Good example, another example is Symphony of Songs. A three-movement piece for chorus and orchestra. And the text of the three movements, you guessed it, Psalms, right, from the Bible. Now, what makes it neoclassical? The second movement of this is a substantial and complicated fugue. So, of course, that's an allusion back to the Baroque period. It has pretty typical construction, subjects and answers, just the way we used to talk about it back in the Baroque period. The third movement, the third psalm, has two ostinatos of different lengths, which are set against each other, so that their beginnings do not coincide very often. There is plenty of dissonance in this piece, but you can most of the time identify whatever the tonal center is at a particular time. So it's only mildly dissonant. Another piece of note is the Mass, dated 1948. It's mixed chorus and double wind quintet. Double wind quintet. 10 players. and it is in a style which we refer to as Neo-Gothic. Why Neo-Gothic? Because in it, he makes an effort to recapture the medieval sound of Machaut. What's the medieval tone quality? Remember?
Bright.
Bright.
Ringing.
Ringing.
Hard.
Straight. Okay? So the notes line up in such a way that even though he doesn't say anything on the music about it, you can just tell from the music, from the sound of it, that this is the way you would play it and this is the way you would sing it in a neo-medieval, neo-Gothic style. Now, why would he do this in the Mass? And by the way, it's the typical movements, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Benedictus, and Agnus Dei. Why would he have this bright, straight, driven sound? Well, it has to do with his feelings about religion. And that is that the word comes from God. And it has to come through a person to other people. But the person it comes through should try to have as little involvement in it as possible so as not to contaminate it. And that's the reason for no voluptuous vibrato, which are connotations of character and emotion and personal contributions and things like that. So it has to do with his feelings about religion and religious expression. Keep the human contribution out of it as much as possible to keep from contaminating. From just this list, let alone a whole bunch of other pieces, you want to take from this the idea that no two pieces by Stravinsky are alike. They're all different. They're all totally original. And it's part of that difference in sound and conception that is, in fact, part of the composition, part of his objective for that particular composition. Each of them are signally different from each other. So it's a little hard to put together a list of things that are a Stravinsky style, because all of his pieces are so different from each other. And I guess that's why there are not as many of them as there are, say, from a composer like Milhaud, where there are thousands. Because each one of them is a different conception. Each one of them is kind of its own little world. However, we could say a few things. So let's make a short list of Stravinsky characteristics. Rhythm is separated from the meter. Now, there could be a regular pulse, but the rhythm patterns are very irregular against that steady pulse. So you can't really tell where the bar lines are by listening. He does have motives, but he can shift a motive to a whole bunch of different places in the measure. So even though we're sort of conditioned to think that the first time we hear something, that's its particular position in a measure, and that's the way we expect to identify it from now on. Not so in Stravinsky. Also, with the patterning he uses, he tends to stick in disruptive silences to mess up the pattern and contribute to the irregularity. And of course, their accents. Irregular accents can make you think that bar lines are in places where they are not. So the rhythm is separated from the meter. Harmony is organized around tonal centers, We don't want to say keys, because when you're talking about keys, you're talking about things that are functional, that are in a hierarchy of importance. That's not the way it is. Tonal centers. However, the chords he's using are often ambiguous as to what they are. So it might have started out as a chord you would recognize, but there are extra notes frozen onto the chord that give it added colors. In fact, he might actually have two separate chords sounding at the same time. Or maybe two different versions of the same chord sounding at the same time. That little thing from the Rite of Spring that I played for you, that's actually two very identifiable chords. It's an F-flat triad with doublings against an E-flat seventh chord, E-flat major minor seventh. So it sounded like, clump, but in fact it's just in two superimposed layers that are very easy to spell and identify. Orchestration, he often sets things for unusual groups of instruments. And therefore, that particular piece has a certain tone color to it because of its unique instrumentation. It's part of the conception of the work. He has a lot of works with piano in them, and the piano has a very percussive effect. There are several important works where he avoids the strings altogether. That makes him a little different from a lot of other composers. All right, well, it's time to get to something that is one of the most important things of the century. And it has two aspects to it that are related, but they are not the same thing. All along, when we have said something is tonal, what did we mean? To the key, right? Okay. Major key, minor key, key. All right. Now, we have music that avoids any feeling of key. Atonality, not tonality, but atonality. That's harder to do than you might think. Because when we hear anything that's in thirds, for example, we're sensitized to imagine a triad. Maybe with notes missing, maybe in an inversion, maybe, but we have a sense that maybe there's a triad at work somewhere. If there's a triad, there must be a key lurking somewhere. Right? Tonal music. So avoiding any feeling of key does take some effort, just because of people's sensitization. The other aspect is what we call serialism. We refer to it with other names also. Dodecapony, dodeca, which means 12, and often we call it the 12-tone technique. Now, if there is a major movement of the 20th century, it's probably this. And even though serialism is pretty much out now, if you were to go to graduate school and get a master's degree in theory, music theory, you're going to take one or more courses that involve serialism. And some of them are darn hard. So it's probably the most significant movement of the century. All right, the father of this is the composer Schoenberg. Dates 1874 to 1951. Now, before any of this serialism that he cooked up, he was a post-romantic composer. Great big ensembles, lots of chromaticism, some dissonance. Bigger, more chromatic even probably than Tristan und Isolde. I'm pretty convinced personally that even if Schoenberg had never invented the 12-tone technique, we'd still look at him as a great composer for his post-romantic style. But as we've said before with at least one other composer, Scriabin, that when it gets to be so chromatic that you don't use a key signature, you just put in the accidentals by the notes anymore, what are you going to do next? What's the future development of anything like that? So Schoenberg has a roughly 10-year period where he produces almost no new music while he's working on this new system, his so-called period of silence. It's not that he was just idle, but he's trying to work all this stuff out. So his music is becoming more contrapuntal, more complicated, more compact, melody becoming very fragmented, harmony so chromatic that all feeling of key is lost, and lo and behold, we have atonality. Not serialism yet, but atonality, the absence of key. All right, so this is the style of Schoenberg from 1908 to 1923. And it didn't just fall out of the sky. As we said, people have been leading towards it, particularly in Germany, trending in this direction anyway, through chromaticism. Schoenberg himself explored the extremes of chromaticism in a great big piece called Gurrelieder. Songs of War, I think. Gurrelieder is for 5 soloists, narrator, 4 choruses, and huge orchestra. All right, so after experimenting with atonality, just avoiding the tonal serialism now, or call it what you like. Now treats all 12 chromatic tones absolutely equally. So whatever dissonance you have, you not only don't have to resolve it, you don't want to resolve it. Because if you resolve it, you're giving the sensation of a tonal center. You can't do that. Right? So, when a composer sets out to compose in the 12-tone technique, he takes the 12 chromatic tones and he arranges them in a certain order. And that order is called the tone row. Okay? Now, any combination of notes, boom, can constitute a chord. It may not have a description. It's just a combination of notes. There is no name for it. It's just a combination of notes. Hence, does not require any resolution. Schoenberg refers to this as the emancipation of the dissonance. The emancipation of the dissonance. All right, well, the early landmark of atonal music, not 12-tone, not serial yet, just atonal, is a piece called Pierrot Lunaire, which you might have some familiarity with, so famous. French, Pierrot Lunaire, at least in the original. It is 21 songs with poetic texts by a symbolist poet named Giraud. You should just know the name Giraud because we know it. Of course, Schoenberg, being German, had it translated into German. And that's the way we know the composition, Pierrot Lunaire, is in German translation. All right, now, this is for a chamber ensemble. It is 5 players that play 8 instruments. So here are the instruments. One person plays flute and piccolo. One person plays clarinet and bass clarinet. Another person plays violin and viola. Another person plays cello. Another person plays piano. So that's 5 instrumentalists playing 8 instruments. And there is also a female soloist who we can't really say sings, but declaims the text in a technique which is called Sprechstimme. Now, this female vocalist is actually presenting her music at approximate pitch. So on her part, the music is written out on the staff, and the rhythm is exactly the way it is on the staff. The notes are printed on the staff as usual. However, the stem has an X through it, which means it is not an absolute pitch on the staff, but it's an approximate pitch. So in other words, this manner of declamation is a cross between singing and speaking. It's not all one or all the other. It's a mixture of the two. So it has to be sustained according to the rhythm, but it follows the contour of the melody, but it's not necessarily the exact pitch that's printed on the staff. Right? So it's sort of a speaking on pitch type of delivery, which you'll hear on your CD. And once you've heard one, you know what Sprechstimme is from now on, because this is just the technique of how you do it. Of course, some people are better at it than others. Now, here's the interesting thing. Everybody who speaks on pitch. If you go to the piano and you just say, good morning, good morning, good morning, about 15 times, and start pecking around, you will find a pitch that's pretty much right where your voice is. Right? You try it. You'll be able to do that. Okay? When we speak, we don't use a very wide spectrum of pitches, unless there's a child in the driveway and somebody's about to back over, and we shriek, look out, something like that. Then we go above what we normally do, or something like that. But our normal speaking range is very narrow. And we hear it as speaking and not singing, because we are changing the pitch so fast that we don't hear it as a sustained singing sound. It's too fast to perceive it that way. But you go to the piano and just say some little thing over and over and over and over and over again, and figure out what pitch it is. And then try to figure out what you have to do to your voice to get very far from that pitch. Well, you have to do really crazy things with your voice to get very far. On the staff, the range of this singing/speaking part is quite wide. And so it takes a tremendous effort to be able to do this in a very expressive fashion and sort of follow the contour of what's on the staff at approximate pitch. It takes people who really sort of specialize in this kind of thing. So approximate pitch as designated on the staff with the X through the stem. Otherwise, the rhythm is exactly the way it is, and it's a piece that's very hard to coordinate. Now, it's very dark, gruesome poetry in a style which we refer to as expressionism. Expressionism. Here's one. I'm not even sure they chose the best ones for the volume 3 that you don't have. This is called Night. Dark, black, giant moths kill the radiance of the sun. A sealed book of magic, the horizon rests, keeping silence. From the vapor of forgotten depths rises a fragrance, killing memory. Dark, black, giant moths kill the radiance of the sun. And from heaven earthwards, they sink with ponderous oscillations, invisible monsters down to the hearts of men. Dark, black, giant moths. Here's another one called Beheading. The moon, a polished scimitar on a black silken cushion. What's a scimitar?
Sword? It's a curved sword.
Sort of a curved sword. So looking at the moon, scimitar against a black silken cushion in the dark of night. The moon, a polished scimitar on a black silken cushion, ghostly vast, menaces downward through pain dark night. Pierrot wanders about, restless, and stares on high in mortal terror at the moon, the polished scimitar on a black silken cushion. His knees knock together under him. Swooning, he suddenly collapses. He imagines in punishment it is already rushing down on his guilty neck. The moon, the polished scimitar. It's dark. Expression. Now, in expressionistic art, you do see things, but they're all distorted and contorted. The idea is that every person deep inside them has a dark side, a tormented, irrational, insane side. And expressionism purports to bring that out and represent it. The opposite of impressionism